Okay, welcome to this detailed video then of the process of composition, the authenticity and the authority of the Pali Canon. So let's crack on. The process of composition, how it got writ. So key is that Buddha wrote no scriptures and neither did his immediate disciples. The Dharma, his teaching, was communicated orally in particular human situations. It wasn't mere information. The Dharma was uh, more than more of a skill that had to be sort of first of all understood as much as known. So the true knowledge of the Dharma came through listening, reflection, and spiritual practice. So you understood it if you did it. Further, in the typical Indian manner, the Buddha's Dharma was always communicated from a teacher, a skilled practitioner of the Dharma, to his pupil. And this was very different from the way we teach in the West. No independent reading, no academic courses, no VLE like you guys have. The process did lead to the eventual writing down of the scriptures. And the process probably went something like this. We have the word of the Buddha, his 45 years of teaching and ministry, his sermons, his preachings, his sayings, his advice on various people, rulings on how to organize and grow the company of disciples, the Vinyasa, as it would become known, and so on. His disciples would memorize his sayings, especially for their own missionary work. And as the death of the Buddha approached, this became ever more important. You have then the first Buddhist council, 3 months after the parinirvana of the Buddha, 500 Arhats who met to unanimously agree on which suttas, which teachings, and which rulings. So the Sutta Pitaka and the Vinaya are authoritative. The Abhidhamma is added later. These are recited and committed to memory. Each week, that would happen anyway in the Buddha's life. So oral tradition is really important. The as yet unwritten scriptures are passed down orally and organized into various mnemonic devices. Buddhists are really good at memorizing stuff. You could learn a lot about that for revision. Incredible memory devices, these devices. So you would have numbered lists. If you think about all the numbered lists you could use to help revise, that's the sort of things that they used to remember these teachings. So after sort of 300 years, 400 years of these different floating oral traditions, each with their own systematized and secondary accretions, add-ons, interpretive commentaries like the Abhinadab, etc., we get to a point where there's a huge, disparate body of knowledge. In the 3rd century BC, this monk travels to Sri Lanka. Mahidina, this Aryat, this monk, travels to Sri Lanka after incredibly having memorized the Pali Canon in his head. And eventually, this is where it starts to get written down. Tradition says this didn't happen, in fact, though, until the 1st century, some 3 or 4 centuries after the Buddha's death. So why so long a period of oral tradition? Well, firstly, the problem, and not the least problem, is the practical problem of writing and storing texts, which didn't exist. If you were writing didn't exist anyway, and if you're a wandering band of disciples, well, how would you carry all these texts and books to travel light? You could memorize stuff and you could travel light. And learning by heart was in fact the tradition of the Shramana groups, who were able to recall the Buddha's teachings through aided concentration, true understanding and practice of his Dharma in meditation and in teaching ministry. it was better than books to memorize this way. You were a proper practitioner if you memorized his work. So, as we're saying, historical context is the Buddha was fiercely critical of the Brahmin use and abuse of their scriptures. Their scriptures were all fixed, reified, and one particular view. It was dogmatic and authoritative, and the Buddha would have none of it. Uh, the possible inherent tension then is between Buddhist insistence on anicca. You remember the idea of anicca, the conditioned flow of life, that everything is impermanent, and scripture, which attempts to fix truth for all time. How can we get these two things to come together? Can we smelt yet another application of the middle way between eternalism and nihilism, so the truth isn't quite fixed, but it is written down? The Brahmin priests were a sort of elite bunch who could then possess and control the truth. And the Buddha didn't really want that. So that's another reason why it was a long time before it was written down. The inventing of writing happened during Emperor Asoka's around 250 BC in India. So early Buddhists couldn't write down even if they wanted to. The emperor commissioned, interestingly, a series of carved pillars to try and convert people all around India. You can see in the map here, you can see one of these pillars, and if you look closely, you can see the writing on it. Still there today. All these pillars around India from the Emperor Asoka's period. One of the most famous is an iron pillar, which some people think is an incredible piece of technology. But the Iron Age had happened during the lifetime of the Buddha. So by the 3rd and 1st centuries BC, we see the appearance of the Mahayana texts, the Prajna Paramita and the Sunya Tavadins. Okay, and more importantly, the poetic versions of the life of Siddhartha. Remember the Bodhikachara, the Acts of the Buddha. Perhaps the need for authoritative texts arose because of debates between Mahayana and Hinayana arguments about what the Buddha actually said. So these texts became yet more important. So the process of writing is linked closely to the process of authority and authenticity. So the significance, the authority, the authenticity of the Pali Canon is important. All of the above is important and relevant when we consider this. Authenticity, the arguments against the Pali Canon being authentic, true and accurate, the word of Buddha, look very strong at first glance. So for example, look, the unreliability of memory, oral tradition, Chinese whisper effect of things getting lost, the sheer length of time before stuff was written down, 3 or 4 centuries before, and the idea of distortions, serious biases, contradictions, etc. Think about the Christian Gospels after a mere 40 years of the process of composition. Scholars like in the 1950s and 60s argue that there's a huge embellishment of the Gospels. Whether that's the case, that's another debate to be had. Come and see me. People engaged in real dialogue, but ideas do tend to adapt and change to fit actual situations. We need to be realistic about this. These adaptations then get passed on and mistaken for the original texts. Another set of arguments against the authenticity is the way mnemonic devices might distort the original teaching of the Dharma, making it very abstract. So we could create a sort of mini halfway conclusion to say that probably it's not the word of the Buddha at all, but some historically garbled version of it that passed down through the centuries. But we can say arguments for its authenticity. We can say oral tradition actually can be a very accurate way of transmission. The tradition of fortnightly recitation of the Vinyasa goes back to the Buddha, goes back to the beginnings of Buddhism, and represents a key act of stability in the Buddhist community for 2,500 years. Still today, Fortnightly, Buddhists meet to recite the Vijnana. Mnemonic devices are quite difficult to distort, on the other hand. In fact, it's the abstractness of much of the Pali Canon means that it is quite authentic because it's so logical. So the stylistic and conceptual coherence of the Pali Canon, Harvey writes, and I learned this quote, he says, there is an overall harmony to the Pali Canon suggesting authorship of its system of thought, if not its actual words, by one mind, i.e. the Buddha. So lastly, the authority and significance of the Pali Canon. The person of the Buddha, even in Theravadan cultures, is held in the highest honor, for he is the one who attained enlightenment unaided, who discovered the truth for himself. And this gives him tremendous authority and power to influence scriptures claiming to be the word of the Buddha. This connection of scriptures with the Buddha helps people trust that the teachings actually work, and they are worth the lifetimes of effort and practice that the Buddhist Dharma calls for, and that the authenticity of the Pali Canon helps to define the identity of Buddhism, enhance the sense of belonging within a community of faith and practice dating back to the beginnings, connecting with past with present. We could argue what matters is not the man, on the other hand, but the message and whether it works. The Dharma as found in the Pali Canon is effective in overcoming dukkha in experience, as some 2,500 years of practice seem to suggest. The attitude to Dharma is as a raft, as something that's provisionally useful, not to be treated as some kind of idol. Think of Protestant fundamentalists who treat the Bible almost as a sort of thing to be worshipped, bibliology. There's no real equivalent to the liberal fundamentalist divide over the nature and authority of Scripture, despite some realist tendencies in Theravada. But Scripture is written in ink, not in blood. Thus, since there's neither an all-powerful God in Buddhism thought to act as judge, nor a religious hierarchy to police the boundaries between faith and heresy, the question of authority is more an existential question than an institutional or absolute question. And more on this you can read from How the Canon is Used by Denise Cush, page 52 to 53. So just to finish off with just one quote from the Buddhist tradition about its significance. What is the word of the Buddha? Suppose a monk were to say, friends, I heard and received from the Lord's own lips. This is the Dharma, this is the discipline, this is the Master's teaching. Then, monks, you should neither approve nor disprove his words. Then, without approving or disproving his words and expressions, should be carefully noted and compared with the suttas and reviewed in light of the discipline. So it's all about tradition, comparison and review with tradition. If something's going to be the word of the Buddha, does it compare with written tradition? But it depends exactly which bits count as the written tradition. In summary, the status, the authority of the Tipitaka is a question that depends upon the tradition of Buddhism we're talking about. In Theravada, the Dharma, the teaching, is understood to go back to the teachings of the historical Buddha he discovered through his own efforts, and they stick very close to the traditional accounts of the Pali Canon, the three baskets of the Tripitaka. The teaching of Mahayana, who largely accept the Tripitaka, but accept sources from other places as well. Note the spelling Tripitaka as in Sanskrit. Mahayana prefer Sanskrit. Think back to one of the Buddhist first teachings. What works for you? The Dharma is not sacred scripture. It's about personal experience, what works for you in Mahayana Buddhism. It's not worshipped slavishly. It's not treated as holy or followed slavishly. It's just an indication of the way. So the other sources, the Lotus Sutra and other sources, are considered also Dharma. It's whatever leads to enlightenment. Dhamma is truth, but Dhamma can be discovered by anyone and using different texts in Mahayana Buddhism. Dhamma always has existed and was taught by enlightened beings before and after Bodhisattva's, the Buddha. Okay, listen again for more on Buddhism.